And joining me now for a bipartisan conversation on how to safeguard democracy in 2024 are four chief election officials from battleground states. Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, Al Schmidt, Secretary of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, Arizona Secretary of State Adrian Fontes. Thank you to all of you for being here for this really important conversation. We know it's a busy time for you, so we really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
We're looking forward to the conversation. So let's start off with the fact that all of you sitting at this table had experienced a form of pressure from the former president, from his allies in 2020, because, of course, they were not accepting the election results. Secretary Raffensperger, let me start with you. As we head into 2024, your state is dealing with two criminal cases surrounding efforts to overturn the election. Is Georgia ready for 2024?
We're obviously ready, and we're battle tested. We've shown that based on the 2020 results. We now have photo ID for all forms of voting in Georgia, and we had an additional day of early voting, 17 days. And we're also going to do pre-scanning, pre-processing of absentee ballots. The results are going to be a lot quicker. But I think I've shown that I'll do the hard work, fight every day to make sure we have fair, honest, and accurate elections.
Secretary Benson, let me turn to you, because 15 people have been indicted in Michigan for their involvement in submitting a fake slate of electors to Congress back in 2020. How is Michigan preparing? Do you feel as though Michigan is prepared?
Yeah, I'm really proud of our work in Michigan to continue to ensure we're increasing the security and transparency of our elections and making our elections more accessible. We'll now have 9 days of early voting in our state that we didn't have in 2020. And we actually have more people signing up to be election workers on both sides of the aisle than ever before, stepping up to protect and defend democracy. And we've also developed efforts to educate citizens about the truth of our elections, bipartisan councils to help go into communities so that they know who to turn to when they have questions about their vote.
And Secretary Schmidt, your take, how are you feeling heading into 2024? We remember that back in 2020, it did take a few days for Pennsylvania to count its votes. What are you doing to make sure that you're ready in 2024? Will anything be or look different?
The Shapiro administration has been very committed to working closely with our county partners. We have 67 counties in Pennsylvania, and the administration of elections is really devolved to the county level. That's where the voting takes place. That's where the initial certifications take place and all the rest. So we've worked with them closely to improve mail-in ballot processing and all the rest.
Secretary Fontes, let me turn to you, because Arizona just indicted 18 people again for a fake elector scheme in your state in 2020. What do you see as the biggest challenges heading into November?
I think the biggest challenge that we are all facing heading into November is the perpetuation of the mis and disinformation from government officials in the United States of America for whether it's political or other gain. This is the problem that is bigger than any other problem, the mis, dis, and malinformation. But we continue to provide good, solid elections across the United States of America for our voters using all of the different techniques that are similar. We all check our voter registration rolls to make sure only valid folks get onto the voter rolls. We audit those. There are checks and balances all the way through the system to the end. And we're going to keep providing good elections for all of our voters across the country.
Well, and go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things, all of us have been a part of the 2020 election in one way or the other, and we've all seen how election officials all around the country are committed to professional operations of our elections, speaking the truth and ensuring that we continue to give voters the confidence they need to cast their vote and know that it'll be counted. And so I'm really grateful for that, all of us, and our ability to rise above partisan affiliation and be professionals when it comes to administering this election. And as we always say, making it easier to vote and harder to cheat on every front.
Yeah, and we do want to do a deep dive into misinformation and disinformation. And as a part of that, there is this election denialism. Secretary Schmidt, top election officials in 2020 called the 2020 election the most secure in American history, and yet more than a third of the country still says they don't believe President Biden won the election legitimately in 2020. How do you, as Secretary of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, address that skepticism? How do you convince voters to have faith in this year's results?
Well, elections have changed a lot in Pennsylvania in the last several years, but they've changed for the better. Elections have never been more safe and secure, with a voter verifiable paper ballot record of every vote that's cast that is used in not one but two audits after every election to ensure the tabulated results are accurate. So they've changed a lot. It's no wonder people have questions, and it's all of our responsibility to answer those questions, provided those people are asking questions and they actually want to know the truth about elections. When you know more about elections, you have more confidence in them.
Secretary Raffensperger, what is your take and what is your approach to dealing with this massive challenge and people not believing the results, not believing that our elections are secure?
Well, I do a lot of public speaking, going out and talking to groups throughout the entire state of Georgia, and really giving them a rear view of what happened in 2020, which was really 33,000 voters just didn't show up on election day, Republican voters that had voted earlier in the year at the Republican primary. But then I talk about what we've done now. We have photo ID for all forms of voting, 17 days early voting, and then we have early scanning of the ballots. Then we've added additional audits in state law, which is a good thing, so we can audit any race, and then we can actually do a 100% hand recount of the human readable text that's right on there. And so we give voters confidence in that process. And actually, the UGA MIT poll said that 99% of all voters in Georgia had a very good experience. And on election night, we just had our general primary last Tuesday. We had an average wait time of under 2 minutes. Sometimes it had at least 1 minute we hit a few times. So that just shows you we don't have long lines. It's a great experience.
I think one of the critical components as well is the notion that it's not just those of us who are on TV who run elections. We've got tens of thousands, almost 10,000 jurisdictions across the United States of America. Those are run by your neighbors, your friends. These are folks in our communities who are doing their level best to make sure that our elections continue to be accountable and safe and secure. And when folks are misguidedly disparaging these elections based on bad information, sure, we hear a lot of these threats and a lot of this nonsense, but it's those folks who are being impacted. And then that's one of the critical components of this. So what I'm hoping is that folks will come around to actually asking intelligent questions, actually following through when they hear the reality of the facts of the situation on the ground, how it is that we run elections, and then go from there. But we've got to all be listening to one another across the country.
And that's the key, is listening. Secretary Benson, to the point about disinformation, how much of your time does this consume? How concerned are you about disinformation as we head into 2024's election?
You know, we said a lot in our darkest moments after the 2020 election, when we were just inundated with these lies and misinformation in an effort to overturn a valid and legitimate election, that the truth is on our side and that transparency is our friend. So we welcome people to ask us questions. We welcome people to serve as election workers themselves so they can see up close just how secure our elections are and how many layers of security we have to ensure that only valid citizens are voting and that we count every valid and only count valid votes. And that the offshoot of all of this, however, is, as my colleague Secretary Fontes has alluded to, are the threats that come to the everyday election officials who are just trying to do our job. And we have to also protect the people who protect democracy. And that's a lot of what we're working to do to prepare for this year.
You take me to my next question, which is about violence, threats against election workers. There is perhaps no more well-known case than that of Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss in your state. Secretary Raffensperger, they were election workers. They believe they were targeted in 2020. How do you address that? How do you convince people, as Secretary Benson is saying, to do these jobs, to put themselves in the line potentially of threats?
I know that some people just went on to do other things instead of coming back for 2024. Yeah. But by and large in Georgia, we're actually in pretty good shape. The counties have done a great job of recruitment. And whenever I speak to groups, I always let them know. I always ask who here has volunteered to be a poll worker. I always make sure we give a standing ovation to that person, because that's really where the rubber meets the road. Elections are run by the local poll workers at each of the precincts, and it's great work. But we also have poll worker training for political party observers. So then all of a sudden they're going through that poll worker training. They understand all the checks, balances, and fail-safes that are in place. So you do have a fair, secure, accurate election.
One thing in Pennsylvania that we've done as it relates to the threat environment is The Shapiro administration created an election threat task force with different agencies responsible for election administration, different agencies with a law enforcement responsibility as well, working together. So should any of that ugliness that we all experienced in 2020 return, everyone knows whose role is what and how to communicate that information expeditiously. So law enforcement can do its job, so our election officials can do the job that only they can do, which is counting votes in our representative democracy.
And you have all received threats, am I right? Going back to 2020, just show of hands. Just you've all, you've all received. Okay, Secretary Fontes, talk about that personally. How did that impact you? How did it impact your family? Did you ever think, I'm going to quit my job over this?
Well, I never thought I was going to quit my job. It's going to take a lot more than threats to get this Marine off of the off of his post. But I will say it impacted all of us. It has impacted not just us, but our families, as you mentioned, as well. But not just our families. You know, when you have to tell your neighbors, hey, pay attention if something happens, the kids might have to come over, or to have go bags ready, or to do any number of these things that so many people across the country have had to suffer through. That's a problem. And I think back to what we were talking about just a moment ago, one of the ways that I have been looking at this and addressing this is telling the really hard truth. And that is that threats against elections officials in the United States of America is domestic terrorism. Terrorism is defined as a threat or violence for a political outcome. That's what this is. And I think the Department of Justice is really ramping up and starting to prosecute. We're working with law enforcement across the country to really start to address these things. It's not too little too late, but we do have to address it for what it is.
And, you know, it strikes me how so much of these tactics to try to delegitimize democracy, attack election officials, it's about instilling fear. Instilling fear as us as professionals, in our local election officials, and instilling fear in voters.
Did you feel afraid, Secretary Benson?
Certainly. I mean, it's really scary when people show up with guns outside your home in the middle of the night and you've got a kid inside you're trying to protect. Yeah, we've all felt that. But at the same time, for me, I think about, the freedom fighters who stood to defend democracy in Selma in 1965. They were afraid, too, and they marched forward anyway because we have a higher responsibility to our country in this moment. And I would argue every voter does in this moment to really decide who we're going to be moving forward. We are going to be a country that lives up to our ideals, stands up for the voice and votes of every citizen, and marches forward anyway. And I think all of us have become more emboldened and committed than ever before as a result of these threats to protect this sacred democracy that we hold dear in our country.
Secretary Raffensperger, do you feel as though the threats that you face made you feel more emboldened? How did you cope with them?
Just put your head down, do your job, do what's right. And that's why people, I guess in Georgia, reelected me with just a huge percentage. They knew that I just did my job. And that's what we're all called to do, is do our job, follow the law, follow the Constitution. And at the end of the day, every allegation that was ever raised, we checked it out, we got back to people. As it relates to threats, really what bothered me the most is the ones against my wife and the ones against my daughter-in-law.
Secretary Schmidt, talk about it from your perspective, and Secretary Fontes has described it as domestic terrorism. Is that how you see it?
Well, the point of these threats is really to terrorize and is to intimidate and to try to keep any of us and our election officials at the county level and at the precinct level from doing or not doing something that is their responsibility, which is such a core foundation of our system of government. So it's important, I think, that we treat them seriously, we take them seriously, we take steps to mitigate against them, and that our people are safe and feel safe at the end of the day. It's important that none of this that we've experienced should keep people from voting, should keep people from stepping up. And I think what we've seen across the country is people willing to do that, people willing to step forward and to make sure that our system functions the way it should.
I want to turn now to something that's getting a lot of attention, efforts to prevent non-citizens from voting. We should note that it's exceedingly rare, and yet some officials believe it's an urgent matter, including yourself, Secretary Raffensperger. Why? And we should note it's already against the law to vote if you're a non-citizen. Because
I believe only American citizens should be voting in our elections. And I ran back in 2018 saying the same thing. I'm the first Secretary of State in Georgia to ever do 100% citizenship verification. And what we found was about 1,600 people that attempted to register, but we couldn't verify citizenship, so they weren't put on the voter rolls. So my fellow Georgians asked me, are non-citizens voting in Georgia? I can say, no, they aren't, because we've checked it. And then we've just won a court case, which came from the left, for the Coalition of the People's Agenda and the New Georgia Project, which was founded by Stacey Abrams. We won that court case because they tried to stop us from doing citizenship verification before people were put on the voter rolls. We won that court case, and because we won that court case, we put an end to it in Georgia. But also, any other state that gets sued can use us as, an example, as a precedent to make sure you can check your voter
We were
rolls.
both going to jump in.
Go
and
ahead.
I think say the same thing.
Secretary Fontes.
I've got good news for everyone. All of us want to make sure only U.S. citizens are voting in our elections, and all of us follow the law, ensure the federal provisions are protected, and that we're ensuring that only valid votes are counted in our state. So we're all committed to that, and I think it's really important for folks to know that regardless of our party affiliation, we're doing all that we can and more to ensure, as the facts show in all of our states, that only U.S. citizens are
But the
voting.
key point you just said, though, was federal provisions. There's no provision for state law other than state law. And so states really should put in their constitution, like the state of Georgia, I've asked them to do, make sure that only American citizens are voting in any election in your state.
Secretary Fontes, quickly.
I think, Secretary Raffensperger, you proved the point with the statement you made. You did an audit, and you found that there were attempts, but none of those folks were actually registered, and none of those folks actually voted. And that means that elections have been safe and secure from non-citizen voting in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, and across the country. So I think this is a red herring. I think there's already a law against this. But Arizona, by the way, we've had no citizen voting law on the books for a long time. We actually have a separate ballot for folks who are federal-only voters. Our standards are higher than everybody else's, but we've still got folks making crazy allegations that they're not. So, we really have to look at the facts.
Quick response, is it a red herring? I want to get to AI, something I know you all want to weigh in on.
Absolutely
But just a
not,
quick
because you look at already, there's the left-wing groups trying to get non-citizens voting in local elections in Washington, D.C., New York City, and in other places. And so if people really truly believe this, then why are we getting sued by the left to stop us from doing citizenship verification?
What is clear is this will continue to be a topic of debate. I want to get to AI, though, because I know you all have something to say about this. Secretary Fontes, I have to start with you because you actually turned yourself into a deep fake to make a very powerful point. Let's look at the video. We'll discuss it on the other side.
Hello. This is a public service advisory featuring an AI version of Arizona Secretary of State Adrian Fontes. This video was produced as part of our 2024 statewide election security tabletop exercise. It was created with both the consent and cooperation of the real Secretary Fontes, which again is not me. I'm an AI impersonation of him.
Whew, Mr. Secretary, that's chilling. That's a pretty good impersonation. Why did you feel that was necessary, and what are you doing to combat AI?
Well, look, I have to reach back into my past, and in boot camp and in other military training that I had in the Marine Corps, we look to the weapons of our enemies and we train against them as much as possible. AI is not a new weapon. It's an amplifier and a magnifier of mis and disinformation. What I wanted to do is make sure that our elections officials were familiar with it. We had processes to deal with it and address it within each of our counties, because our elections are run at the county level as well. We also had a tabletop exercise among several for elections officials for the media, so that our media partners could know how to react to it and recognize it. And in June, we're doing tabletop exercises for law enforcement. So the way that we're dealing with it is lowering the excitement about it, taking away the newness of it early, so that our folks will be able to not just recognize it, but understand how to deal with it as quickly as possible.
Secretary Schmidt, what are you doing in Pennsylvania to address this?
So we're obviously monitoring this environment. We have a team focused on it. And I think one of the biggest concerns is, how much AI has developed in the last few years. In 2020, we saw absurd threats it just spread so easily. Knuckleheads from other states putting guns in their car and coming up to the convention center in Philadelphia to try to prevent votes from being counted, eligible votes from being counted. So people get motivated by somebody's idiot uncle posting something on Facebook. This is a far greater concern.
How do you address that, Secretary Raffensperger, when people are looking online and believing what they see? What should people look out for?
Well, as it relates to that, it's really just getting out as quick as you can to try and break that narrative so that conspiracy theory doesn't have time to germinate and just spread all over the country.
Final 30 seconds.
We have to protect voters from being fooled by this new technology. And like my colleague, Secretary Fontes, we're doing tabletop scenario planning exercises. We've also passed laws in Michigan to ban the intentional use of AI to deceive citizens around political issues and require disclaimers and disclosure of AI-developed technology. And I hope the federal legislation will pass as well to put this in every state.
Well, I cannot thank you all enough for being here for this incredibly informative conversation. We'd love to have you all back. Extraordinary to have you all sitting here at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.